Have you ever listened to the news in English? How can listening to the news help you improve your English? And are there any downsides, any disadvantages to listening to the news? Reza isn't with me this week, but we do have a special guest on the podcast, and he's in the best position to answer questions about listening to the news. Welcome to Aprender Inglés with Stephen and Craig. Hello, and if you are a new listener to the podcast, you're very, very welcome. I'm joined today by Stephen DeVincenzi, who is a podcaster, an English teacher, and I think it's fair to say a news expert, because he has a daily podcast that focuses on helping students of English, just like you, to improve their English by listening to the news. Stephen and I talk about why he started his podcast, where he gets his news from, the advantages and the disadvantages of learning English with the news, and the future of news reporting. We also talk about fake news and many other interesting topics. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Stephen, and I hope you do too. So here is Stephen DeVincenzi from send7.org, the Simple English News Daily Podcast. Stephen, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
It's great to be with you, Craig. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, I'm going to ask you the first question that I ask guests that come on to the podcast so that listeners know how to place your accent. Where would you say your accent is from?
I would say my accent is from southern England, maybe to be more precise, the southeast of England. So I grew up in a town in Kent, which is basically the southeast of England.
Which town?
It's a town called Sevenoaks. Well, I grew up in a little village outside of Sevenoaks. And today I live in a different town in Sevenoaks called Canterbury, which is famous for its cathedral.
And its language schools, I think, as well.
That's absolutely right, Craig. Yeah, wow. I didn't know that you'd knew about them, but there are lots of language schools around here, actually. Did you have some experience with one of those?
I haven't taught there, but I heard of language schools in and around that in the Canterbury area. Would you suggest students go there if they want to go to the UK to improve their English?
Definitely, yeah. Disclaimer, I don't work for any language school, but it's just a really nice place to be. It's quite a nice size, so you can walk around everywhere, but it's big enough to have lots of things going on. There's lots of bars and restaurants, and there's a theatre and a couple of little cinemas, and there's plenty going on. It's a beautiful place. There's lots of very old buildings going back to the Tudor times, and of course the cathedral, which is the centre of the English Church, Anglican Church.
Are the local people friendly? Because that's the problem I have with London and other major cities in the UK. People don't tend to have time to speak to people trying to improve their English. Are people friendly in the area?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think people are friendly. Because there's lots of language schools, it's quite common to have groups of young people from like Spain or Italy or Germany or France or something going around together. And I think the people in the shops and that they're kind of used to that. So, yeah, I think people are nice.
Well, there you are. Canterbury, that's a place you should go to study English. Now, Stephen, I've asked you on the podcast to talk about your podcast and your website. The address is send7, send7.org. What is Send7? What does the name mean? And what's the podcast about? Tell us about it.
Yeah, Send7 is an acronym, which means that each letter stands for a word. And the words are Simple English News Daily. And the 7 stands for 7 minutes, because it's a podcast which is 7 minutes long. So Send7 is Simple English News Daily in 7 minutes. It's a podcast which comes out every day, Monday to Friday, and myself and sometimes a co-host just tells the most important news which is happening anywhere in the world, so all over the world, in just 7 minutes. So in fact, I had a review on Apple Podcasts recently which described it better than I could describe it myself, or better than I have described it myself, which was like a helicopter view of the world, which I thought was really nice, and it's true actually, because we just kind of touch upon a story happening in one continent, and then we go to another continent, and then we go to another continent, and then we go to another continent, so that hopefully after the 7 minutes are over, you feel like you've learned what's going on today in the world.
And is your background in English teaching, when you speak about the news and you explain the news to people, does that come from a background of teaching English?
Yeah, it does. So in fact, before you asked me what my accent was, and it's definitely from the south of England, but also I have been teaching English for such a long time. And also, I suppose, just living in countries where people don't have English as first language for such a long time, that I think that my accent has kind of neutralized.
Yeah, mine has too. That happens.
Yeah, it does happen. But hey, I think it's a good thing. Hopefully we're just easy to understand, which is good. And I taught English in Spain for a year.
Oh, which part of Spain?
In Granada.
Oh, wow, in the south. Mm-hmm. Lovely.
Yeah. Oh, it's absolutely beautiful. I love Granada. And I lived in Argentina for 2 years as well. And also in India for 6 months, and Thailand for a year, and Australia for a year, where I wasn't teaching English, because actually they speak English quite well in Australia.
Yes, they do. They and sometimes people confuse the Australian accent with the British accent.
Yeah. I've never understood that, because to me it just sounds so different. But I've heard quite a few people confuse the two. So
obviously you've got a background in English teaching. Your podcast is about communicating the news to people who want to improve their English. What motivated you to do that in the beginning? I think you started the podcast back in 2020. Was that
Yeah.
That smells a little bit like COVID time? Was that the reason?
Yeah. I tell you, yeah, the COVID times was probably the final push, the thing which made me go, right, I've got a bit of time, I can do it now. But it was definitely an idea that I had for a while, maybe a year or so.
Where did the idea come from originally?
I think the idea mostly came from the way that I was learning, or kind of keeping up with my Spanish and French, because I lived in France for a little bit as well, and I studied French at school, I studied Spanish at school. I can have a decent conversation in French, and my Spanish is pretty good. And then I came back to the UK, a few years ago, and I lost my contact with those languages. So not really wanting to do formal classes or learning specifically, I just started to listen to podcasts in French and Spanish, and a lot of it was based on the news. Sometimes I listened to live news, because I was always a bit of a news junkie as well, keeping up with the news a lot. And I thought, I wonder if there are podcasts which are just like talking about the news in slow English as well, which is similar to what I was listening to in Spanish and French. And yeah, when I tried to search for it in English to see if it existed, it didn't exist, or didn't exist in the way that I imagined that it could exist. So I thought I would do it myself. And as happened with lots of people during COVID times, I found myself with a little bit more time on my hands. And so that was the moment to press the record button. And it's worked well enough for me to keep doing it until now. So.
Well, I'm really pleased you did. You mentioned that you consider yourself a news junkie or a news addict. Now that you're not only, let's say, listening to the news for pleasure, but you're also listening to produce the podcast, does it depress you? Because most of the news that we get tends to be bad. And because you're
Yeah.
focusing on that 5 days a week, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's true. I suppose I was already in the world of reading and listening to a lot of news anyway.
Right.
Yeah, really, I've always kind of kept up with what's going on all over the place for hours a day anyway, so I was kind of used to it. But yeah, regarding the depressing factor, yeah, it's true that what comes up on the news most days is, yeah, it's more likely to be bad than to be good. But I'm a very optimistic person overall, somehow.
Even today, after
Even
doing the
today.
podcast 5 days a
I
week
know.
for 3 years.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? But yeah, I am. I think it's because I know some basic facts about the world and the way in which we're moving, which is generally positive. Like there's been a few like downhill things recently, especially since COVID. But if you look at the general trajectory of the world, we are actually improving all the time. Poverty is at one of the lowest levels it's ever been, especially if you look at like the percentage of the people in the world who are living in poverty. And lots of diseases. There's a lot less people dying of certain diseases. If something like malaria is just coming down all the time. And like, yeah, there's been some little negative things that have happened recently, which have kind of reversed some of these trends since COVID. But I think I'm quite optimistic that overall we're going in the right way. And also one thing which is really important is that one of the reasons that the news is often covered in bad things is because bad things happen quickly. They happen instantly. There was an earthquake and 1,000 people died. Bang, that's big news, right? But whereas good things that happen by their nature are generally things that happen slowly. And because they happen slowly, they don't make the news. You don't hear 10,000 people came out of poverty yesterday.
Yeah.
You don't hear a new drug for some disease you've never heard of has been saving thousands of people's lives every day since it was invented 6 months ago. Maybe if there's a new technology or science which comes out, it can make the news. And I try to get some of this stuff into Simple English News Daily whenever I can. But the reality is that a lot of the good things that are happening in the world, they don't happen on a single day. Whereas, unfortunately, the bad things that happen generally do happen in a single day. So it's more likely to make the news. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes absolute sense. And perhaps also bad news tends to grab people's attention more, and fear also tends to get them watching. If they're afraid that something's going to get worse or it's going to affect them in their personal lives, then they're more likely, I think, to follow the news and react to it rather than something good or something uplifting, something positive. So as you say, it's also a sudden thing, but I think also bad news tends to get headlines and gets people's attention. And these days with the internet and apps and websites, they want people's attention all the time. They want to keep you watching what bad thing's going to happen next. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I suppose it can be a good thing to read more traditional news, newspapers and things like that, and also to listen to podcasts,
especially yours.
That are especially mine. Yeah, of course.
Goes without saying. Right, so where do you get your news from? What are your news sources that you use when you're putting together the Sen 7 show?
Yeah. I was going to say, actually, just it can be a good thing to go out of your lane, if you like, out of your echo chamber. Especially if you're in social media or something, to broaden where you're getting your news from. But where does Sen 7 get its news from it's from many different sources. To try not to be too controversial, it's generally news which is kind of agreed upon by many different sources. But some of the main ones are Reuters, which is a fantastic media agency. They've just got journalists all over the world. So it's very, very up to date. Associated Press, which is quite similar, and a lot of the national news agencies use Reuters and Associated Press to get their stories from. And then also some more traditional places like the BBC and Sky, Al Jazeera. I'll also look at national websites and newspapers to see things that are happening in particular countries.
Yeah, that sounds very balanced. And you mentioned echo chamber before. If the listeners don't know, the echo chamber is where you keep hearing your same political viewpoint over and over again because you're just getting the news source from the same political view or the same channel that you believe in, which is very similar, to confirmation bias, isn't it? Where you believe something's true, you believe a particular thing, and then you go to a place where you're going to hear that reinforced. You're going to hear people saying what you believe, which is why it's a good idea to get your news sources from various different political viewpoints, or because media does have, generally speaking, an agenda. It does have a particular way of looking at the world, I think.
Yeah, I'd say that the echo chambers of social media are kind of like a more extreme version of what would have previously been confirmation bias. So if we just use the United Kingdom as an example, people who previously would have been more right-wing, more likely to vote Conservative, would generally be more likely to read a newspaper like The Telegraph, or generally the more working class side of that would have been something like the Daily Mail. And then on the left-wing side, more likely to vote Labour, they would be more likely to read The Guardian or The Mirror or something like that. And when people are starting to read those things, then they would go into their own confirmation bias of stories kind of telling them what they want to hear. Whereas with the echo chambers of social media, which, to be honest, I think are worse, it's where you have stories being given to you, algorithms giving you similar stories to things that you've already looked at, or videos that you've already looked at, and things like that, which can often involve making your views more extreme on any particular topic.
So that's true, isn't it? It's the algorithm that's throwing up or showing you news based on what you've liked before, rather than you actually making the decision to go somewhere because you like the way they report the news.
Exactly right. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think that it's probably true that has made our society a bit more polarized, and has made it more likely that people don't want to look at what the other side thinks. But hey, I'm optimistic about that as well. I think that
you are incredibly optimistic. Yeah. I love it. I love it. And Stephen, so do you ever, because I think in your position, I would really feel like expressing my opinion about the news you're reporting. Do you ever feel like that? Do you ever feel like you just want to maybe go on YouTube or start a different podcast that's your view on what's happening rather than being centered and neutral?
It's difficult because one of the reasons that Simple English News Daily is popular, and it's actually one of the most common emails I've got from listeners and reviews and things, is saying that it's unbiased, saying that they like the fact that it's just tells the facts as it is and doesn't have any opinion. So I kind of think it's very important to keep the podcast like that. But yeah, I mean, there are times when I would like to give an opinion, and I'll give it to my friends in
friends
private.
And family. Yeah,
but, yeah. But maybe one day in the future, if on somebody else's podcast or something, maybe I might give an opinion. But at the moment, I'm too scared.
No, I absolutely understand that. I do not like to talk about politics or things that are divisive on the podcast. And under protest, we spoke about Brexit years ago because so many people asked us to speak about Brexit. So at the risk of dividing the audience, we did a podcast on Brexit, which is now history. And while we're speaking about the news this week, here's some breaking news that we've just received this second. In fact, I don't even think Stephen has heard that my next online conversation course is starting very soon. And you too can improve your fluency, your confidence, and many aspects of your spoken English by joining me and a small group of lovely students on Zoom. We meet online and we have discussions, debates, role-play activities, and lots of fun, all focused on topics of interest. For more information, send me an email to craig@inglespodcast.com. And regular listeners to this podcast who miss Reza this week can also study with him. Reza gives one-to-one private classes over the internet and in the comfort of your own home. To get in touch with Reza, send him an email to belfastreza, that's BELFASTREZA @gmail.com. And now let's get back to Stephen and ask him the best way that you can learn new vocabulary when you listen to the news in English. Let's take a step back, Stephen. What's the best way from a student's perspective to learn common news vocabulary? Because there's typical words that keep coming up in the news, keep reoccurring, things like government clashes, to clash, to axe jobs, to snub. At the moment, we've got hostages all over the news. Then there's a shake-up of the cabinet that was recent. So can you give any advice to students who want to listen to the news? How would they approach it?
I suppose the first thing to say would be that if it's the first time you're trying to listen to the news in English, then you're probably not going to understand everything straight away, because there are some strange words, some strange vocabulary. Actually, in my podcast, we generally don't use them as much, but if you're listening to a BBC News or something like that, there are going to be some things that you don't understand. One idea could just be to keep listening and try to work it out yourself. Of course, you can Google it or something like that if you know what the words are. In fact, one advantage of having the news as a way of learning another language, I find, is that if you already know something about that story in your own language, then it can actually help you to know what is being said in the other language. For example, over the last week or two, I, in English, have been speaking about some of the protests in Spain, and so they might have heard a sentence which involves the amnesty deal for Catalan separatists or something like that. And for people who have never heard anything about that before, they are very likely to not understand that. But if people have been following that story in some way, they've heard some of that vocabulary, and if they're living in Spain, then they will probably have heard some of that vocabulary in Spanish, then it's probably more likely that they are able to understand using the context in English as well.
Yeah.
So knowing a bit about the story can really help.
That makes a lot of sense. And also, I suppose, because a lot of the words in the news are repeated quite often, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, maybe in the beginning you need to focus on that vocabulary, learn some of it. But then again, it is going to be repeated probably the next day in a different news story, because it does tend to be specific to the way news is reported. So I suppose a double-edged sword, it's good and it's bad. It's a little bit tricky, a little bit difficult in the beginning, but then with time you'll be surprised how easily you're understanding the news.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, one of the negative points of learning English through the news is that you are likely to hear the same thing quite a few times. And like you say, double-edged sword, that's good for learning that, but it's not good for learning other things. But of course, you do know that it's always going to be grammatically correct, and it's a good way for learning some certain structures of sentences. Yeah.
So, Stephen, what are some of the advantages, some of the good things about using the news to improve the students' English?
Yeah, I think it's definitely not for absolutely everyone. There are some people who are more likely to enjoy learning through stories or something else, fiction or reading, or even just old-fashioned studying with books and things like that. But for me, the reason that it's been interesting for me to learn through the news is because it's fresh. It's just new every day. So I know that whatever I'm listening to is going to keep me interested. Yeah, it's very relevant to the day. And I've had some listeners say to me that they will, they'll put on their coffee in the morning, they'll make themselves a slice of toast, and during that time, they've already listened to the news in English, and that's kind of hit two birds with one stone. There you go, you can explain that one if you want, by telling them what's going on in the world, and also they've got their connection with English for that day. So even if they don't have some formal practice of English during that day, at least they know that they've listened to a bit of news. There you go. So it's fresh and interesting.
Yeah, so to kill two birds with one stone, to do two things at once to get positive results. For example, Send 7 is 7 minutes. You can walk to your bus stop or your railway station, or if you have a very, very short commute to work in your car, you can also listen to the podcast, get some news, and you're doing two things at once. You're multitasking. You're killing two birds with one stone.
That's exactly right.
So let's look to the future, because I've noticed recently people focusing on the possible dangers we might see with fake news. Are news sources reliable? Can we believe what we're reading in news apps and videos on TikTok and Instagram and AI generated content? Because now apparently with AI you can create fake videos using the face of a famous politician or a famous commentator. So how are we going to know in the future? Are we going to be able to believe anything we read or see on the internet?
Yeah, it's a good question, and obviously the easiest thing to say is I don't know. It's very difficult to be able to predict the way that this is going because it's changing so fast. Really, the difference in the abilities of artificial intelligence and things like that over the last 5 years has developed really, really quickly. And I think 5 years from now, it's very difficult to say. But one thing I think could be interesting is that we might actually go backwards in one way, which is that recently people have been going away from what people call mainstream media. So your traditional sources of information, newspapers and media companies, television. And I think that there may be a new place for those media organizations about being able to work out what's true and what's not in a way that we by ourselves are just not able to do. So I think, for example, when there's a new video coming out where you've got Joe Biden saying, all right, we're going to invade Russia or something, there may be people going, oh God, what is this? What is this? And the only way to know whether it's true or not is going to be to go to the bigger organizations, to go to the BBC and to go to Reuters and whatever. And they will probably have the information. They'll have their own fact checkers. They'll have their own connections to the original source of the information. And they'll know more than we will be able to know. So I can see that happening, possibly. But yeah, I do think that it would be a problem. And to get some optimism in here, Craig, as I like to, I also think that we as people are probably going to get a little bit better at working out what news is likely to be fake.
Critical thinking and analysing.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I know this is a bit of an anecdote. It's not based on statistics. And I hope I don't offend any older listeners when I say this, but when I see things being shared on social media, especially Facebook, that I think are quite likely to be fake news, it generally, at the moment, I see it coming from older people. And I wonder whether this is because the older people that I know have grown up in a time where news was written by big organizations and newspapers, people who have a reputation to protect, people who, if they lied or said something incorrect, then they could be sued, they could lose their credibility. Whereas with fake news, which is coming out and sometimes being made by AI, as you said, there's nothing to lose there. And I feel like perhaps younger people, they have grown up in a world where anything can be fake, anything can be made up. And so they're more used to not trusting it and, questioning where things have come from. And I think maybe future generations are going to be more used to that than people are today and older people are today.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I'm pleased you said what you said about institutions and organizations becoming more trustworthy, that we can trust them more, because I've noticed that the last few years that there's been this swing away from trusting news organizations, and especially during COVID with even health services. And now it seems that we're going to need those respected institutions and organizations in the future to know what's true and what's not true.
Yeah, that's right. It's become very unfashionable to trust organizations, media organizations, even, as you say, health institutions, experts. It's become kind of unfashionable to trust any organization like this. But the truth is we really need these organizations, because the alternative is people just doing their own research and things, which generally ends up with worse results, I think.
Yes, I agree. Well, I'm pleased we've ended on quite an optimistic, positive note. So speaking about things changing, let me ask you a couple of different questions off the topic of news. What have you changed your mind about recently? And it cannot be something connected to the news.
Okay. Yeah, that is a really difficult question. Do you ask this to everybody who comes on, Craig?
I've asked it a few times. I think it's an interesting question. And to be clear, I did send this to you beforehand to give you some time to think about it.
And you did. And I was thinking about it. I was even thinking about it just now when I was eating my lunch. And I have come up with something. But nothing else is jumping to the top. One thing that I've changed my mind about slightly, not a reversal, but a kind of giving myself a bit of nuance, is that I've been vegetarian for maybe 7 years or something like that, since I lived in India. I lived in the west of India in a place called Gujarat, where basically everybody is vegetarian. And it's generally just from a place of like thinking, I don't want to kill animals, and I don't really want to get somebody else to kill the animals for me. It's generally from that kind of point of view, with a few other things coming in, but that's mostly it. But over the last year or so, or 6 months or so, I've kind of loosened up a bit, because...
What do you mean by loosened up?
Like, for example, I have eaten meat a few times, less than 5, but a few times, but it's always been because I don't want to lose some kind of cultural experience or traditional experience of being with people. So if I'm going to go to someone's house, maybe before I would have said, by the way, I'm a vegetarian. But today I wouldn't, because I kind of feel like I want to do what they do. Especially a few months ago, I went to Serbia, and I just didn't tell the people that I was going to see there that I was vegetarian. I went to see a family, because I want to live like they live. I want to do what they do. I want to have that kind of true, more cultural experience, which wouldn't be possible if I were, telling them that I was vegetarian.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Did the meat agree with you, or did your body feel strange when you had it?
I felt very heavy. I felt a bit like getting a punch in the stomach.
Yeah.
For half an hour or so, but it was okay. Yeah. yeah.
Another question, Stephen. The last one, actually. What one thing, if you were to tell someone about yourself, would they find it difficult to believe?
Yeah, this one took me ages to come up with as well. But I've decided on before I started my podcast, I had only had a smartphone for a year, which, just to put some perspective there, that means that I started the podcast in 2020 and I didn't have a smartphone at all until 2019. I was still using old school Nokia brick phones.
Was that because you were traveling? You were in India and those kind of countries where they weren't so common?
Not really. I think it was actually just that I didn't really want to join in with the rest of the world, so got their phone in their hands all the time. I kind of just didn't appeal to me. Yeah, I in fact only ended up getting one when it wasn't actually possible for me to get an old school phone anymore. And then by doing that, I discovered podcasts. And I was like, wow, where have you been all my life? And so I'm now somebody who uses a phone for many, many hours a day because I listen to podcasts all the time.
Yeah. So it's changed your life for the better, I think.
Completely, yeah. But I think that there's still some positive things that came out of that period of time where I wasn't using it at all. Like one thing I've noticed is that my sense of direction is better than all of my friends.
Yeah.
So we'll go out somewhere and we'll go, oh, let's go back to the car. And I'll be like, okay, follow me. I know exactly how to get there. Like, what? Don't we need to get out Google Maps or something? And I'll say, no, I just remember.
Oh, I would be lost without my Google Maps. I get lost in my own flat. I've got a terrible sense of direction. But
yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So send7.org, SEND7, the number 7.org. There will be links in the show notes. And Stephen, there are transcripts for people that are just starting and maybe they have a slightly lower level. How can students get those transcripts?
Yeah, so the podcast itself is completely free. So it's every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. If people want to get the transcripts, then they can become a supporter, which is really how we are able to keep the podcast going. So it's just a small monthly or yearly fee to get those as well. There's also a weekly quiz that comes with that as well, and I'm trying to add some more things onto that to sweeten the deal next year.
Fantastic.
But, people can look in their podcast apps for Simple English News Daily. That's the way that it comes up in podcast apps.
Simple English News Daily. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You do a wonderful job with bringing the news to students of English who might not otherwise find it so accessible. So thank you for the work you do. Best of luck in the future, and I hope we get a chance to do this again soon sometime.
Thank you so much for having me, Craig. It's been a pleasure.
Many, many thanks to Stephen for coming on the podcast, and thank you for listening. But wait, don't go anywhere yet, because it's your turn to practice your English. So where do you get your news from? What are your sources, and do you trust them? Do you have any comments on what Stephen and I discussed during this podcast? We would love to hear from you. Please send us a voice message and we will include it in a future podcast. To do that, go to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. You only have 90 seconds to leave your message. So if you want to speak for longer, just attach a voice message to an email. And your emails go to me, Craig, CRAIG, @inglespodcast.com. And to write to Reza, send him an email to belfastreza, REZA, @gmail.com. This podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. Why not visit the online store where you'll find some courses and content to help you improve your English. Go to store, store.mansioningles.net. And finally, before I say goodbye this week, thank you to all of you who are helping us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. And you too can be a Patreon supporter for as little as $1.50 per month. And by doing that, you get instant access to recent transcriptions of this podcast so that you can read every word that you hear. Go to patreon.com, patreon.com/ Ingles podcast. And we'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. We don't have time to mention you by name, but we will say hello and thank you to our latest supporters who have joined us this month. And they are Abel, Pedro Carrillo, Jose Maria Rodriguez, Juan Miguel Marabel Gonzalez, and Alejandro, who kindly has donated more than the minimum amount. Thank you to you and to everybody on the Patreon program. If you enjoyed this podcast and got some value from it, please tell your friends so that more people can listen. And next week, Reza will be back for another podcast. So until then, have a wonderful week. Thank you for listening, and it's goodbye from me. The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.